uh, congratulations on the show, and for being over the last couple of years one of the most exciting composers out there. It's such a weird thing in a good way when tech people get recognized as like almost not a brand necessarily, but like the fan club, like the Roger Deakinses of the world, where you're like,
Wow.
oh, people know your name even if they don't necessarily know, even what you do. Oh, they do something with music, right? Oh yeah, but he does the thing for the movies I like. It's got to be a cool feeling.
That's very kind of you to say. No, I mean, I feel very lucky to get to do this, and honestly, I mean, just ever since I was a kid, I love music, and I was always so inspired by movies, and um, I think you always dream as you get older, you dream like of finding collaborators like Barry Jenkins, for
Yeah.
example, but it's a dream, I mean, you don't so much as you know well, I mean, so much of this is the collaboration,
Yeah.
and everything is so interdependent. So it is very special when you're able to work with people like Barry, for sure.
Oh yeah, and then the fact that you can continue to do it. So many people, end up for hire, which is nothing wrong with that, obviously. And then there are people who, sort of hitch their wagons, like, oh, I want to work with my friend, I want to work with my partner,
Sure.
and you know, that's great, but you don't always luck out in that, oh, it's Barry Jenkins and it's going to be, Oscar worthy movies and, prestige television, and everything he touches is, deemed important, which is, like kind of like what you're saying. It's luck of the draw, like, and talent, but it's got to be also
Yeah.
really cool, but also kind of scary. Every time you go to work, you're like, oh, I'm making a thing people are going to care about with a capital C.
Well, I think there's a huge responsibility and immersion that we do in everything, in all of the works that Barry. I mean, we really we spend so much time together on these projects, and actually, I would say in particular on the Underground Railroad, Barry and I actually spend more time together on this than anything we've ever done combined, for a variety of reasons. But it's a very immersive process, and that's also, I think, part of my own sort of artistic philosophy with this too. Is I think the way to do this is to be in the room together, to see the same things, to hear the same things, to really have that in-person kind of collaboration. So it's spending the time together and really devoting yourself to the fullest to these projects. It's sort of, I think that's the challenge, and that's the joy of it too.
Yeah. Is it easier when you've worked with people a couple of times because the shorthand? Because I gotta imagine, you the first time you have a conversation with, a filmmaker or a showrunner, I think you're feeling each other out and know the language. Barry or Adam McKay, like people you've worked with a couple of times, it's got to be a little easier because they, even in terms of like knowing what they like and what they maybe don't like, they can say it without offending you, or you can
Oh
talk
yeah.
around like, oh, my strength is here. If you want me to do this, it's not going to work.
Well, it's definitely exciting as you discover that you have this sort of, I sometimes, I was just joking with Adam with this the other day, there's almost like a telepathy where you're like, oh, I know what he's
Yeah.
looking for. Interestingly, there's early on, with Barry and me on every project, there are these I really cherish those early conversations that I have with Barry, because he has such incredible initial instincts, but at the same time, he's so open to exploration and discovery. But interestingly, along the lines of what you're talking about, an Underground Railroad, I had read the book, and one of the
Yeah.
first conversations that I really had with Barry wasn't a conversation. What happened was he was on set in Savannah, and he sent me. I received an audio message, like a text audio message, which is weird because I don't normally get like audio messages from Barry.
Yeah.
And I opened it up and listened to it, and it was just the sound of it sounded like a machine like drilling or something. And I was like, what is this exactly? So then about 2 or 3 hours later, literally, so 2 or 3 hours later, I get a text from Barry, and it just says, "Did you get what I said?" And immediately I was like, I know exactly what he's talking about.
Yeah.
because what he was talking about was, this was the first kind of way in. This was the idea of drilling, of going into underground, of going down, and that started a whole series of kind of experiments on elemental forces and earth and air and what's in the air and insects and cicadas, sort of, but it was that kind of thing like you're talking about, where I think if Barry had sent that to me 6 years ago before we had worked together, I might have been more confused but when he's just said, did you get what I sent? He didn't even have to say anything. I knew exactly what.
Yeah, it clicks. Well, that's the thing. You want to be able to be on the same wavelength, especially when you're doing something different. Like there's a very easy way to, okay, it's set in the past. Okay, I know what that sounds like, and it's set outdoors, so I know what that sounds like, and you start to build out like a portfolio. Or if you're doing comedy, it's a lighter sound and it's jaunty, and you just feel like there's like a guy walking down the street. You kind of have that in your head. But then when you work with someone enough times to be like, well, it's comedy, but it's comedy where you're going to be very uncomfortable the entire time. So it's got to be almost like, think more of a horror movie almost with my sound. Or, Moonlight is still, everything is about feeling. And Barry especially, he's a very emotive filmmaker. So the music is even more important because you're telling the story, I think, as much as he does. It's a very, even partnership that is rare, I think.
Well, and it is something I think for both of us, it's very important on every project. Like every project deserves its own musical world. And that's really, I think that's a key initial starting point. Personally, I never want two projects to sound the same or even similar. I think just as a composer, I think one of the excitements is to constantly explore things. It's also one of the challenges to make sure that, I think we all have aesthetic preferences. They're perhaps, every composer probably has chords or types of things they like. That's sort of what makes us who we are. But at the same time, I think over time, I'm always very careful if I feel I'm veering towards something. I'm always like, oh, no, I know that. I don't want to do that. I want to, you want to kind of always keep yourself a little on your toes. And I think that, what you were talking about before though, as well, about like, what is the right sound of a project? And I think it's actually a really, really key question. I think it's a really fascinating and mysterious question too. I don't think there's a right answer. There's an infinity of possible scores for any project, but I think for me and for Barry, every single time, we sort of and we talk about this, that we want to let the projects tell us what they're looking for. So Barry, like I said, will have these, on Moonlight, he knew from the very beginning, he wanted an orchestral type of sound, but we also had that early conversation about what if we applied the chopped and screwed technique to my own music? Like, what would that be? Or, on Beale Street, his first thing he said to me was that he was imagining the sound of brass and horns. So I went off and experimented. But all that being said, that didn't mean that the direction was going to be that, because what we actually discovered was that, I wrote some pieces for brass and he loved the music, but when we put it up against the picture, it wasn't right. So there's this constant kind of learning process really that happens as we go. Like we're really never finished until we are finished. And it's constantly, there are things that I learned and discovered, after I had done episode 10 of Underground Railroad that made me want to go back and do more on episode 1.
Which is, I'm sure, a lovely feeling to have. You're like, oh God. But yeah,
we're always learning.
Yeah, it's interesting because left to your own devices, I'm sure there's a sound. If someone just said write a score without knowing what you were doing for what project, something would come out and it would sound like your work. But you have to then make it fit the picture. And like you were saying, like the brass sounds very like period New York. In your head, that would make perfect sense for Beale Street, but you put it up and you go, oh, well, the feelings of it aren't hitting.
That's the thing, and you have to be open to this. So that's actually one of the key things I think about all of this, not just about collaboration, but especially I think about film scoring, which is that, you have to be so willing to throw things out right away. You have
10 hours of my life just gone.
It's real, like, and even things that you love. Barry is so he's such a generous and supportive collaborator, because he'll always, he'll be like, this is beautiful, but it's just not.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep it and like.
Yeah, he'll listen to it. He'll be like, I'm listening to it all the time, but it's not going in the project. So those kinds of things. And I would actually say that one real learning element for me has been this idea of like, it's sometimes, or more often than not, it's the things that don't work that actually tell you the most about what might work.
Right. And that's going to be an interesting tool for 10 episodes of a series, because it is more music, and like you said, you don't want to repeat yourself, and you're obviously contributing to the story, but you're also, the sound should feel of the same thing, but also progressing or regressing depending on what's happening in the story. That's, I mean, for someone like me who bought a guitar and it sits on my wall because I just can't make it work, 90 minutes of music sounds insane, but 10 individual scores essentially that are then tied into one larger one. I mean, my dog is looking at me strangely. That's how I look at you doing this. It's like, so how do you find the baseline to start even?
I will definitely acknowledge this is the largest scope work I've ever done. I mean, it is, Barry and I talked about it. It felt like we were making 6 movies worth of music, and also I think one thing that's really inherent in the Underground Railroad itself is that, by contrast, let's look at like something like Succession, where episode 1 to episode 2, it's still the Roy family, and we're still basically in the same world. In the Underground Railroad, as Cora goes from episode 1 to episode 2, she's going into a different state, literally, but also a different state of mind, and a different, there are anachronisms, historical anachronisms. There's magical realism. The world itself is a question mark at times, and so the music actually changes depending on where we are. So that's something that's a whole other layer of challenge and of scope, where obviously we want things to tie together, and there's a larger scale architecture of that. But as opposed to more of a traditional episodic series, this is much more like this, like a larger work with many chapters, all of which require their own soundscapes.
When you are working on something and there's going to be songs also, is that helpful, or is it also kind of like I'm working around it and I'm worried? Because it depends on the movie, but especially like a period piece or something like even like Battle of the Sexes, where you just know like the sounds of that era are going to be around. How much do you try to put that out of your head and just make your music, and how much of it is, well, it may lead into a cue for something everyone's heard, so how do I make sure that's not jarring?
It's a good question. I think it depends. Honestly, it sort of depends on when and where I get involved in the process. For example, Moonlight, I was involved very early. And although, in the script, for example, Hello Stranger was written into the script, for the diner in Moonlight. But I was involved very early. So I think to a great extent, the musical landscape was really me and Barry sort of imagining it, totally separate from whatever the music was going to be in particular places to some extent. Although we had this chopped and screwed idea, which obviously did wind its way into the movie as well. With something like Battle of the Sexes, it's a really good question, because I think I came onto that project after the movie was shot, after they had been editing it. And so actually that informed the type of sound that I approached it with, where there was this sort of more period needle drops. And I wanted my score that, we had those conversations of like, well, what if my score had sounded like it was almost recorded in that era, and how could we do that? And, it affected how I thought about the string sound and the types of things. So, obviously it sort of depends on the project, but at the same time, it's always important to know about these sorts of things. Just because, I think you do as much research as you can, you learn as much as you can about the project, hopefully before you get into it.
For sure. Yeah. I was actually curious about that, because when I've talked to other composers, like, some obviously, I'm the third person to see the script, because, I work with this filmmaker every single time. So I'm, thinking about the chords I want and my music before anyone else is involved. And there's people who are like, well, I came on, we're locking picture in 8 weeks. So, whatever you can come up with is better than what we had. So good luck, and when you come on late, is it an interesting challenge, because you're like, okay, I'm almost like the closer of a baseball game. Like I'm here to finish this. Like they're happy up until now, so let me finish this. As opposed to like Barry, who's, I'm dreaming of this. Come on with my dream, and if it fails, we both fail together.
It's interesting. I haven't thought about it that way actually. And to some extent, I think there's different pressures with both.
Yeah.
I think the pressure, if there is one, I mean, I really enjoy that sort of creative brainstorming, but I think to the extent you're on very early, there's so much time. And then there's also the openness is sometimes so vast of
Yeah.
what is what is the sound, the what
For
question.
this, I'm sure, especially, it could have been anything.
Could be any, like, what is this? That's a big question. And I think the alternative is its own set of pressures where, like you said, this movie's basically done.
Yeah.
You're the missing piece. The counter to that though is that sometimes there's also, I think creatively, I think a lot of composers find it as an asset sometimes when there is this very limited window of time. It's like, okay, you have 8 to 12 weeks and then it's done. Sometimes I think there's psychologically something nice about that, where that there's a finite kind of window,
Oh yeah, you're like, I can't mess around. I'm here to just do the work.
The process is going to stop in 8 weeks, so
like if I have 3 minutes shy of music, they're gonna not have that music. They're gonna figure something out.
Exactly.
It's gotta be fun in that way of like, okay, I'm wanted because they like what I do. They may not know me from a hole in the wall, but they like my sound. But they've also done their own thing. So you get there and you go, well, this sounds nothing like me in terms of what I think they're going for. Okay, how do I piece this together? As opposed to, like, especially here, Barry going, I know what you do. I love what you do. Now do the most of it. The most you've ever done.
Right. It's like, and I think with Barry, I've used this analogy. I mean, it really is a journey that we go on together. And I think that's amazing. I mean, he's so involved with it. And I take, the initial starting points, that initial inspiration is always directly from him. That's kind of how we get going with it. And I find that so inspiring. He is just such a brilliant, inspiring person. And I think the other types of projects, I think when I'm, if and when I work with people I haven't worked with before, I think the key question is, usually I will have seen, if someone wants to work with me and we haven't worked together, I will see what they have. And then I'll sort of say, here's what I'm like, if I were to do this, here's my thoughts, and if that feels interesting, then it's the sort of continued conversation, but I think it is always important to have some kind of artistic coming together at the very beginning, because if it's too open-ended and you have a limited period of time, there's a
chance of disaster. Oh yeah. As we wrap up, I just want to first of all say congratulations, and I mean it in the sense of, like, the sound that you do is unlike anyone else's, and I think makes people very excited. Obviously people are excited for anything Barry does, and Adam McKay and so many of the people you do work with. But okay, and Nicholas Britell came onto this movie. That's interesting. And I mean, it's gonna be very unsurprising, but also very cool when you win your first Oscar.
Well, can't even imagine that right now. But thank you. I mean, it's been these years have been incredibly exciting, and I love getting the chance to do this. I sort of count my blessings every day with that, and getting to immerse in these projects it's just been a fascinating experience. So I feel very lucky to be able to do it.
Awesome. More to come, but definitely keep like a running tally with Barry on awards and see who comes out first, because you can really clean up with the right score. There's a lot of music awards out there.
Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I appreciate it.